The salt air was heavy, thick with the scent of an approaching storm and the rot of old cedar. But that wasn't what made his chest seize. It was the silence. The kind of silence that only exists after a door has been slammed shut, after a woman has walked out and taken every sound in the house with her. Jung-ho stood in the doorway of the maid's room and did not move, because moving would mean deciding what to do next, and he had not yet recovered the part of himself that made decisions. The sheets were still warm. He knew this because he had pressed his palm flat against them before he could stop himself. One involuntary gesture, the body reaching for confirmation of what the mind already knew. She had been here. She had slept here, or tried to, in the narrow bed designed for function, and not for comfort, for rest, and not for the kind of night that leaves a room feeling altered. The pillow still held the shape of her head. He looked at it the way a man looks at evidence at a crime scene, with a distance he was constructing in real time. With the careful professional remove of some understood that if he let himself feel the full weight of what that indentation meant, something structural inside him would give way. On the nightstand, a single glass of water, half empty, beside a uniform, folded with the precise corners of a woman who had spent 3 years making herself useful and unobtrusive and impossible to fault. She had folded it before she left. That was the detail that undid him. Not the leaving, not the silence, not even the shape of her absence pressed into the pillow. The fact that she had taken the time, in whatever state she had been in, to fold the uniform neatly and set it down like something being returned. Like a thing that had never been hers to keep. His hands were still shaking. He noticed this the way you notice weather, distantly, as a fact about conditions rather than a fact about yourself. He had fired her before the sun came up, before his hands stopped shaking, before he could remember with any clarity what the night had actually been, or what it had meant, or whether meaning was even the right word for something that had happened in the space between exhaustion and surrender. He had used the voice he kept for endings, flat, final, absolute. The voice that had closed deals and severed partnerships and erased people from his world with the clean efficiency of a man who understood that sentiment was a liability he could not afford. "You're fired." 2 words. He had managed 2 words. And then she had packed her bag, the same bag she had arrived with 3 years ago, and walked out the gate into a city already bright with early light, and taken the silence with her. And left him here, standing in a room that still smelled like her, pressing his palm against sheets that were growing colder by the second, waiting for his hands to stop shaking. They hadn't. 48 hours earlier, Amira Blade had known 3 things before breakfast. She had known that the housekeeper was stealing. Small amounts, irregular intervals, the kind of theft designed to look like a counting error. She had known that the man in the East guest room was not a business associate, but a creditor, and that his presence in the house meant something had gone sideways in a deal that was not supposed to exist. And she had known, from the angle of light through the corridor window and the particular stillness of the upper floors, that the boss had not slept. She knew these things the way she knew everything in this house, by being invisible. 3 years had taught her that invisibility was not passivity. It was a discipline. It required a specific quality of attention, a calibrated awareness of every room she entered and every room she didn't, every drawer slightly more open than she had left it, every conversation that went quiet when she appeared with fresh towels or a tray. You did not become invisible by accident. You became invisible by deciding every single morning that your survival mattered more than your presence. Amira had made that decision so many times it no longer felt like a decision. She moved through the Dalton estate the way water moves through a system of pipes, following the path of least resistance, disappearing into walls, reappearing exactly where she was needed before anyone thought to ask. The other maids called her the quiet one. The senior housekeeper called her reliable. The boss in 3 years had called her nothing at all. She was not certain he knew her name, and she had decided, carefully and deliberately, that this was the safest possible arrangement. Somewhere in a drawer in her room was a nursing degree she had stopped thinking about. It was not that she had given up on it. It was that giving up implied a specific moment of surrender, a conscious turning away. And what had actually happened was slower and more structural than that. The debt had come first. Her mother's medical bills, then her own tuition, compounding with the quiet persistence of things that grow in the dark. The nursing position she had been promised had dissolved when the clinic lost its funding. The agency had placed her here as a temporary arrangement that had calcified, over 36 months, into something that resembled permanence. She was 26. She had a mind that catalogued detail with clinical precision, and a face she had trained to reveal nothing. She knew which rooms held secrets, and which held only the performance of them. She knew the rhythm of this household the way a surgeon knows a heartbeat. Not just its steadiness, but the exact sound it makes when something is about to go wrong. That sound had started 2 days ago. She had not yet understood what it meant, but she had heard it. And Amira Blade, in 3 years of careful invisibility, had learned to trust what she heard. The deal had died at 4:47 in the afternoon. Jung-ho knew the exact time because he had looked at his watch in the moment the call ended. A reflex. The way you note the hour when something important stops, as though time itself needs to be marked as a witness. The man in Busan had spoken for 40 seconds. He had used careful language, the language of someone who had rehearsed the conversation and wanted it to end cleanly. Jung-ho had said nothing in response, because there was nothing to say that would not reveal something he could not afford to reveal. He had thanked the man. He had ended the call. He had sat in the back of the car for 11 minutes without speaking, watching the city move past the tinted windows like a film he'd already seen. Then he had told the driver to take him home. This was the first mistake, not the deal, which was a loss he could absorb and restructure and eventually recoup. The mistake was going home instead of going somewhere that required performance. A dinner, a meeting, a room full of people who needed something from him. Performance was containment. The house was not. The house knew him too well. He poured the first drink in the study without tasting it. The second he carried to the window and stood there in the way men stand when they are performing solitude for an audience of themselves. One hand in a pocket, weight slightly back, the studied posture of a man in control of his circumstances. Outside, the grounds were dark. The perimeter lights threw long shadows across the lawn. Everything was exactly as it should be, and the exactness of it felt. Tonight, like a kind of accusation. He had built all of this as evidence of what he was. On the wrong nights, it felt like evidence of nothing else. The third drink he poured without thinking about it, the glass refilling itself in his hand with the automatic logic of a habit, old enough to have its own gravity. This was where it lived, the thing he spent most of his life refusing to acknowledge. Not in failure, which he had systems for. Not in loss, which he had always been able to reframe as data. It lived in the particular combination of exhaustion and stillness that happened when the performance had nowhere left to go. He felt things. This was the problem, the one he had never solved, and had instead learned to bury beneath action, beneath precision, beneath the carefully maintained architecture of a man who required nothing and was therefore invulnerable to losing it. Feeling anything was a form of losing. He had decided this young and built a life to prove it. He set the glass down, stood, walked out of the study without destination, driven by something older than strategy, something that lived beneath the skin and refused to be reasoned with. The house contracted around him as he moved. Her door was ajar. It was always ajar. She had learned in the first month that closed doors in this house attracted attention of the wrong kind, and attention of the wrong kind was the one thing she could not afford. So she left it open by exactly the width of a hand, enough to signal nothing to hide, not enough to invite. Jung-ho stopped in the corridor outside it. She heard him before she saw him. The particular quality of a footfall that has lost its purpose, the sound of someone moving through a house without destination. She had catalogued this sound before, in other corridors, on other late nights when the household ran wrong. She knew what it meant. She set down the uniform she was folding and waited, the way you wait when you have already decided what you will do, and are simply allowing events to catch up to the decision. He appeared in the gap of light. He was not looking at her the way a boss looks at staff. That look she knew. The efficient, unseeked scan of a man confirming that a function is being performed. This was something else. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something they did not expect to find, something whose existence rearranges, briefly, the architecture of the room. She did not look away. "You should rest," she said, not unkindly. A door offered. He didn't take it. He came into the room the way exhausted men enter spaces that aren't theirs, without full permission, without full intention, moving on the quiet logic of a body that has stopped consulting the mind. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and the room absorbed him. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke, because the silence between them had shifted into something that did not require speech, something that existed in the register below language, where two people simply confirm, without words, that they are both still human. She remained at the table. He sat on the bed. The distance between them was small enough to feel, and large enough to be a choice. When he reached across it, slowly, without demand, his hand settling near hers on the table's edge with the tentative gravity of a man who had forgotten what warmth felt like and needed to confirm it still existed. She looked down at his hand, and she did not pull away. This was the moment she would return to, later, in a borrowed room above a bakery, with the smell of bread rising through the floorboards and a truth growing inside her she had not yet named. Not what followed, not the night itself, with its complicated tenderness, and its silence, and its two people at the very edges of themselves. But this, the fraction of a second in which she had looked at his hand and made, without ceremony, without strategy, the most dangerous choice available to her. She had chosen to be seen. The night did the rest. He woke before she did. This was deliberate. Some part of him had stayed watchful through the night, monitoring for the exact moment when sleep shifted, and the room became navigable again. He dressed in the grey half-light with the focused efficiency of a man restoring himself to his correct shape, each button a small act of reassembly, each familiar gesture returning him to the version of himself he knew how to be. By the time he was done, the architecture was back in place. He found her in the kitchen an hour later. She was standing at the counter with her back to the corridor, slicing vegetables for the household breakfast with the same mechanical precision she brought to every task. Her shoulders were level. Her hands were steady. If the night had left any mark on her, it was buried somewhere the light couldn't reach. And the composure of it, the sheer disciplined composure, did something to the machinery he had spent the morning rebuilding. It made him afraid of her. Not the way men are afraid of women who want something from them. The way men are afraid of women who don't, who have already taken the measure of the situation and arrived, quietly and without drama, at a position of perfect self-containment. She needed nothing from him. Her hands kept moving. The knife found the board with its steady rhythm, and the sound of it was the most destabilizing thing he had heard in years. He said it before he had finished deciding to. "You're fired." The knife stopped. One beat, a single surgical pause. Then she set it down on the board with a care that was worse than any reaction he had prepared for, and turned and looked at him with eyes that held no surprise. Only recognition. The particular recognition of a woman who has seen this before, not from him specifically, but from the category of man he represented. Men who reach for warmth in the dark and cannot bear its existence in the light. She packed in under 10 minutes, the same bag she had arrived with. She moved through her room with the economy of someone who had always known, on some unexamined level, that this was temporary, that everything here had been borrowed, including her own invisibility, and that borrowed things are returned without ceremony. She left the uniform on the bed, folded, corners precise. He did not watch her go. He heard the gate. The catch of it, the finality of a mechanism completing its function, and then nothing. The silence she left behind her, settling into the house like weather. She was in the taxi when the nausea arrived. It came without warning, sudden and total, and she pressed her hand flat against her sternum and breathed through it, watching the city open up around her. It passed, the realization did not. It arrived in the space the nausea left behind, quiet, irrevocable, rearranging everything. And she sat very still in the back of the taxi and understood, with the same clinical precision she brought to everything, exactly what it meant. 10 days passed the way damage passes through a structure, quietly, invisibly, revealing itself only in the details. The glasses were never in the right place. This was the first thing, the small thing, the thing he told himself didn't matter. She had kept them on the second shelf, left side, grouped by height with the unconscious precision of a woman who had organized this kitchen so thoroughly that its logic had become invisible, present only in its absence, like a grammar you don't notice until someone breaks it. The new girl put them on the first shelf. He moved them back twice before he understood that he was doing it, and then he stopped moving them and stood in front of the open cabinet for longer than was reasonable, looking at glasses in the wrong place. The laundry came back wrong. Not badly. The new arrangement was perfectly adequate. Everything clean. Everything pressed. But the fold was different. A fraction of a degree off the geometry he had stopped noticing 3 years ago because it had simply been correct, and now its absence was a kind of static he couldn't locate or silence. He said nothing. He was a man who did not complain about laundry. He lay in bed on the 8th night and stared at the ceiling and thought about a fold. He started looking for her on the 5th day. Not through channels. This was the thing he couldn't examine too directly. He had channels for everything. Men who could locate any person in the city within hours, who could pull addresses and routines and photographs with the efficient invisibility of a well-funded machine. He had used them without hesitation for problems far more complex than finding a former member of his household staff. He didn't use them. Instead, he drove through the neighborhood she had mentioned once, obliquely, in a conversation he had no reason to remember. Something about a bus stop, a market, a detail so minor it had no business surviving in his memory at all. He sat in traffic on streets he didn't know, and looked at faces through tinted glass and understood, with the slow clarity of a man arriving at an unwelcome conclusion, that this was not a search. It was a penance. The channels would find her. That was the problem. The channels would find her in hours, and the report would come back, and somewhere in that report would be the confirmation he couldn't bring himself to receive. That she had chosen to disappear. That her absence was not circumstance but decision. That a woman who had spent 3 years making herself invisible had finally, deliberately, applied that skill to him. His power had never failed him before. It had bent situations and broken people and remade outcomes he had no right to change. It had no purchase here. The house kept forgetting her wrong. He kept correcting it. The glasses went back to the second shelf, left side, grouped by height. He told himself it was order. He knew what it was. The room above the bakery was smaller than her room at the Dalton estate, by exactly the amount that mattered, and not 1 inch more. She had measured it with her eyes on the first morning. The practiced spatial assessment of a woman who had spent years navigating other people's houses and had learned to calculate, immediately and accurately, how much of herself a space could hold. The answer here was enough. A bed, a window, a shelf for the nursing textbooks she had retrieved from her sister's storage unit on the 2nd day, moving through the city on public transit, with the quiet purposefulness of someone who had already decided that purposefulness was the only available currency. She paid the first week's rent in cash. The landlord didn't ask questions. She didn't offer answers. The bakery job came through a notice in the window. She had seen it from the street while looking for the bus stop and walked in before she could construct a reason not to. The owner was a small, direct woman who asked 3 questions, received 3 honest answers, and offered her 4 morning shifts and a discount on bread that turned out to matter more than the hourly rate. She started the next day. Her hands, trained for 3 years in the precise service of other people's comfort, adapted without difficulty. Work was work. She had always known how to do it. The hospital credential took longer. The nursing board had her on record. The degree, the incomplete placement, the gap years that required a supplementary form and a competency review, and a patience she assembled deliberately, piece by piece, the way you assemble anything you cannot afford to rush. She submitted the paperwork on the 6th day. She followed up on the 9th. On the 11th, she received a provisional approval and a start date at a downtown clinic, 2 afternoons a week, which was not what she had trained for, and was not nothing. She was frightened. She had decided to be frightened quietly and continue moving, because the alternative was stillness, and stillness, in her experience, was where the worst things caught up with you. The pregnancy test she had taken in the chemist's bathroom on the 3rd day. She had known before the result confirmed it, had known in the taxi, in the particular quality of the realization that had settled into her after the nausea passed, with the clinical certainty of a woman who had studied the body's grammar and recognized this sentence. The test was merely punctuation. She sat with it for a long time, not with grief, not with panic, with the focused stillness of someone taking accurate inventory of a situation before deciding how to move through it. She thought about her options the way she thought about everything. Methodically, honestly, without the luxury of pretending any of them were simple. She thought about him once. Briefly. Then she shelved it. There was bread to wrap in the morning. There were textbooks on the shelf. There was a start date on a piece of paper that meant she was, incrementally, and without assistance, rebuilding the life the debt had swallowed. She turned off the light and slept. The appointment had been routine. Jung-ho submitted to these quarterly examinations with the same disciplined compliance he brought to any maintenance function. The body was a system. Systems required monitoring, and a man who ran an empire could not afford the operational failure of ignoring his own infrastructure. He sat on the examination table in the private clinic on the 14th floor and answered the doctor's questions with the efficient brevity of someone who had somewhere more important to be. The doctor was thorough. This was why Jung-ho paid him. He worked through the blood work with the measured cadence of a man who had delivered 10,000 results and had learned to read the room before he read the numbers. Cortisol elevated, stress manageable, blood pressure tracking high, workload expected, and then a pause, small enough that another patient might not have noticed it. The pause of a man deciding how to present a piece of information he wasn't certain was his to present. Jung-ho noticed it. "There's a notation here," the doctor said, with the careful neutrality of someone choosing each word individually. "From a cross-referencing flag our system ran last week. A free clinic downtown. They share anonymized markers with our network for rare blood-type research. You're on the registry, as you know." Jung-ho said nothing. "The flag is a match. Same rare marker, same secondary indicator. The combination is..." The doctor paused again. "Statistically singular. I've only seen twice in 20 years of practice." The room was very quiet. "The patient registered under a different name," the doctor continued, looking now at the file rather than at his patient, offering him the privacy of not being watched. "But the marker doesn't lie. The clinic recorded a confirmation of pregnancy at approximately 6 weeks. Jung-ho heard the words arrange themselves into meaning with the slow, terrible precision of a translation he could not stop and could not unhear. He sat with the information for 3 full seconds. The way you sit with a structural diagnosis, the way you receive news that doesn't change what has already happened, but changes irrevocably what happens next. Then his knees buckled. Not dramatically. There was no collapse, no sound. Simply the sudden, total withdrawal of something that had been holding him upright. And he was sitting on the chair beside the examination table without having decided to sit. His hands gripping the armrests, the room narrowed to a single point of light that was not hope, but its nearest living relative. The doctor was saying something. Jung-ho couldn't locate the words. He was thinking about a folded uniform, a half-empty glass, a woman whose hands had not stopped moving when he walked into the kitchen, who had set down a knife with devastating composure, who had packed a single bag and walked out a gate into a city that didn't care, who had been carrying this, alone. For 14 days, his hands, for the second time in 2 weeks, would not stop shaking. He made the call from the car, not from the office, not from the study where he made decisions of consequence. From the back seat of the car outside the clinic, still in the particular stillness of a man whose knees had recently reminded him that the body has its own opinions. The city moved past the windows with its usual indifference. He looked at his phone for a moment before he dialed, aware that what he was about to do was different from anything he had done before, not in mechanism but in meaning. He had used these channels to find a supplier who had vanished with a contract. He had used them to locate a man who owed him considerably more than money. He had used them twice to confirm information about people who were negotiating against him in bad faith. He had never used them to find someone he had wronged. The distinction mattered. He turned it over briefly, honestly, the way he had learned in the last 14 days to turn over things he would previously have buried. And then he made the call, because the alternative was another 2 weeks of wrong-folded laundry and glasses on the wrong shelf, and the specific impotence of a powerful man searching streets he didn't know through tinted glass. He gave the instruction once, clearly, without elaboration. Find her. Not a former employee. He didn't use those words. He said her name, Amira Blade. And the man on the other end, who had worked for Jung-ho long enough to understand that the texture of an instruction contained information the words didn't, asked no questions, and ended the call. The report came back in 41 hours. He read it at his desk, at 11, in the evening, the study quiet around him, the glass of water he had poured and not touched standing on the corner like a small reproach. The report was thorough. Address, employer, daily schedule, the supplementary detail that his man always included because thoroughness was the service Jung-ho had always paid for. She was living above a bakery. He read the address and placed it with the precise geographical awareness of a man who knew this city as a system of assets and districts and transit corridors, who had driven through every significant neighborhood in the back of a car and absorbed its coordinates as data. He knew the area the way you know a place you have never needed, theoretically, distantly, as a location that existed on the map without existing in his life. The report noted a provisional nursing credential, 2 afternoon shifts at a downtown clinic, 4 morning shifts at the bakery below her room. She was working 2 jobs. She was rebuilding. She had not gone to ground. She had gone forward, which was somehow harder to receive than hiding would have been. He folded the report, sat with it. Then he did something he had not done since he was young enough that the habit had no name yet. He didn't send anyone ahead. He wore a coat over the suit. This was not a disguise. He was not naive enough to believe that a coat changed anything fundamental about the way a man like him occupied space. It was something else. A concession, maybe, to the neighborhood he was entering. An acknowledgement that arriving in the full architecture of who he was would be a kind of aggression. And he had caused enough of those. He told the driver to stop 4 blocks away. The rain had been falling since morning. Not heavily, the persistent, directionless kind that doesn't commit to a storm but refuses to stop, that makes the streets smell like wet concrete and old iron and something organic underneath. The city's actual smell, the one that doesn't reach the 14th floor or penetrate tinted glass. He turned his collar up and walked. He had forgotten what it felt like to move through a city on foot, not the physical mechanics. He was not a man who had let his body go soft, but the texture of it, the way the world arrives at a different resolution when there is no glass between you and its details. A woman pulling a cart of vegetables, the wheels catching on a crack in the pavement. Two men arguing outside a phone repair shop with the comfortable ferocity of people who have been arguing for years and intend to continue. The smell of frying oil and rain and bread. Bread, specifically, warm and specific. The smell of something being made rather than purchased. He walked through it and felt, with a clarity that was almost painful, how much of this had always been here. The bakery occupied the ground floor of a narrow building on a street where the lights worked every third pole. The sign was hand-painted. Through the window, he could see the counter, the shelves, the particular amber quality of light that exists in rooms where something has been baking since before dawn. He could see movement behind the counter, but not faces, not yet. He stopped outside. He stood there for 20 minutes. He was aware of this, checked his watch at the 5-minute mark, and again at 12, and again at 18. Each check a small audit of himself. A man confirming that the waiting was chosen, and not simply failure. The rain continued. His shoulders were damp. He did not move. Then he went in. The bell above the door announced him to the room with a cheerful indifference to the weight of the occasion. The warmth hit him first, bread and heat, and the close, honest atmosphere of a place that had never tried to be anything other than what it was. Amira was behind the counter. She saw him before the door had finished closing. He watched it happen, the fractional adjustment of her gaze, the precise moment of recognition, and her hands did not stop moving. She was wrapping a loaf in paper. She kept wrapping it. Her hands did not stop. The other customer left. Jung-ho hadn't noticed her until she was gone. An older woman with a paper bag and no interest in the man standing too still near the door. The bell marked her exit, and then the bakery was quiet. Just the two of them, and the rain against the window, and the smell of something cooling on the rack behind the counter. Amira set the wrapped loaf down. Did not come around the counter, did not invite him further in. She stood where she was, hands resting loose at her sides, and waited with the particular quality of patience that belongs to people who have learned that silence is not empty, that it has weight and texture, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply not fill it. He took 2 steps toward the counter and stopped. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "I know." The word landed flat, not an apology, not yet. Just the acknowledgement of a man who had arrived without a strategy for the first time in his adult life and was discovering that the absence of strategy left you with nothing between yourself and the truth. He had rehearsed nothing. This was deliberate. Every version he had constructed in the car, in the study, in the 14 days of wrong-folded laundry, had felt like the wrong instrument. Too polished, too controlled, the kind of language that protects the speaker rather than reaching the person being spoken to. He had thrown them all out somewhere on the 4-block walk and arrived with only what remained underneath. "I fired you," he said, "because I couldn't bear to look at you after that night. The rain against the window, the bread cooling." "I know," she said. 2 words, the same 2 words, and yet entirely different in weight from his. Hers carrying not surprise, but the quiet confirmation of a woman who had already done the work of understanding, who had sat with the truth of it in a borrowed room above this bakery, and arrived, without his participation, at the same conclusion. "I told myself it was necessary." He heard his own voice as though from a slight distance, monitoring it for the performance he had promised himself he wouldn't give. There wasn't one. That was the thing that surprised him most, how little was left when you removed the architecture. It wasn't. It was fear. I was afraid of what you'd seen. I know that too, she said. I was wrong. The last word cracked. Not dramatically. A hairline fracture, the kind that appears in things that have been load-bearing for too long. He didn't repair it. He left it where it was, visible, because repairing it would have been the old reflex, and he was trying, with the clumsy sincerity of a man learning a new language at the wrong age, to resist the old reflexes. Amira looked at him for a long moment. The assessment was not unkind. It was honest, which was more valuable and considerably harder to receive. I'm not coming back, she said. Not to that house. Not to that job. Not to the version of me that survived by being invisible. Then I'll find a new version. The words came without calculation, and their lack of calculation was the most truthful thing he had said in years. Of the arrangement. Of he stopped, started again. Of how this works. She didn't answer. She didn't refuse. She stood behind the counter of a bakery in a part of the city he had walked to on foot in the rain, and she let the silence hold the question he hadn't quite finished asking. She turned back to the counter, not away from him. The distinction mattered, and he felt it with the precision of a man who had spent a month learning to feel distinctions he had previously ignored. She turned back to her work. Another loaf, another sheet of paper, her hands resuming the rhythm that his arrival had not interrupted and his confession had not broken. She was not dismissing him. She was simply continuing to exist in her own space, on her own terms, and the difference between that and rejection was the entire distance between a closed door and an open one. He didn't move toward the exit. He wasn't sure he could have, even if the moment had called for it. The bakery held him with the gentle authority of a place that had no interest in his importance. The warmth of it, the smell of it, the absolute democracy of a room where bread was the primary fact, and everything else was secondary. He had spent his life in rooms that rearranged themselves around his presence. This one didn't. He stood in it like an ordinary man, and felt, beneath the discomfort of that, something he didn't immediately have a word for. Relief, maybe. The relief of not being the most significant thing in the room. Amira worked without speaking. The paper crinkled. The rain found a new register against the window. Harder now, the indifferent drizzle resolving into something with more conviction. He listened to it, and to the small sounds of her hands, and did not fill the silence, because he had, finally, imperfectly, begun to understand that the silence was not his to fill. She had not said yes. She had not said no. She had turned back to her work and allowed him to remain, and in the economy of what Amira Blade permitted, he understood this to be significant. Not a concession, not a forgiveness, but a provisional fact. He was here. She had not asked him to leave. The distance between those two things was exactly the size of whatever came next, and whatever came next was not his to determine unilaterally, and he was learning, at considerable cost, and with considerable difficulty, that this was not a loss. It was a different kind of arrangement entirely. The rain fell harder, the bread was warm. He stood in the doorway between the counter and the street, not quite inside, not quite out, occupying the threshold with the patience of a man who had never once in his life waited for anything that mattered, and was discovering, at the exact moment it was most necessary, that he could. He did not check his watch. He did not reach for his phone, or construct the next move, or calculate the variables. He simply stood in a bakery, in a part of the city he had walked to in the rain, and waited for the first answer that had ever cost him enough to be worth receiving. The door stayed open. Everything was exactly where it was meant to be. She made the tea herself. This was deliberate. He had moved instinctively toward the kettle when she indicated it, the reflex of a man accustomed to either commanding service or performing grand gestures, and she had said quietly and without sharpness, "I'll do it." Not a correction. A boundary drawn so gently it felt like an invitation, which was, he was beginning to understand, how Amira Blade did most things. The distinction between what she permitted and what she controlled was the entire grammar of who she was. She made 2 cups, set one on his side of the counter without ceremony. He sat on the single stool, reserved for the owner during the slow afternoon hour. And the counter between them was formica and worn at the edges, and the most significant piece of furniture he had ever encountered in his life. They didn't speak immediately. The rain had settled into a steadier rhythm, purposeful now, the sound of it filling the bakery with the particular acoustic intimacy of being indoors while weather happens outside. He wrapped both hands around the cup. The heat of it was simple and direct, and he held it the way he had been holding things lately, carefully, aware of warmth, unwilling to put it down. "The clinic," he said finally. "Downtown." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "The report mentioned it," he said, not an apology for the surveillance. They were past the point where pretending he hadn't used his channels would serve either of them. Provisional credential. 2 afternoons, Tuesdays and Thursdays. She set her cup down. "Pediatric intake. It's not the position I trained for. Is it close?" She considered, the question with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "Closer than this time last month." He nodded. Something in him that had been braced for the entire conversation began, incrementally, to release. Not because anything was resolved, because nothing was, but because she was answering him. Directly, without performance, in the plain, honest register she brought to everything. She was telling him about her work. She was letting him ask. He did not mention the pregnancy. She did not mention it either. It existed between them like a room they had both agreed to stand outside of, for now, present. Significant, its door visible from where they sat. There would be a time for that room. This wasn't it, and they both knew it, and the knowing was its own kind of agreement. He finished the tea, set the cup down with the care of someone returning a borrowed thing. "Same time tomorrow," he said. Not a question, but not a command either. Something in between. Something without a name in his previous vocabulary. An offering made without guarantee of receipt. Amira picked up his empty cup, turned to the sink. "The bakery opens at 6, she said. She didn't tell him not to come." He walked out into the rain and did not look back, because some things are not meant to be confirmed, only trusted, held lightly, carried forward into whatever version of things came next. The door closed behind him. It was not the same door he had walked through an hour ago.